The gymnasium doors slammed open and the entire seventh grade froze mid-laugh because a boy named Caleb was on the floor with a bloody lip and three older boys standing over him. And the only person walking toward that circle of laughing kids was a gray-haired janitor named Thomas Reyes, holding a mop like it was the only weapon he needed. And what none of them knew, not the bullies, not the teachers hiding in the office, not even Caleb himself, was that the man walking toward that fight was about to do something that would end with the richest man in the state standing in a middle school hallway, shaking, asking a janitor to forgive him. Before we go back to that gymnasium, if this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who still believes kindness is stronger than money, because this story is going to prove it to you in ways you won't see coming. Now let's go back. Thomas Reyes had worked at Ashford Middle School for 11 years. He was 61 years old, and his knees hurt every morning before he even got out of bed, and his back hurt every night before he went to sleep. And in between those two aches, he pushed a mop down the same hallways, cleaned the same bathrooms, and fixed the same broken locker doors that the school never had enough money to replace. Nobody at Ashford Middle School knew much about Thomas. They knew he was quiet. They knew he always said good morning to every single kid he passed, even the ones who never said it back. They knew he kept butterscotch candies in his front pocket for kids who looked like they were having a hard day, and somehow he always seemed to know which kids those were. What nobody knew, because Thomas never told anyone, was that 20 years ago he had been a teacher. A real teacher, with a classroom of his own and a family waiting for him at home. He had a wife named Grace and a son named Danny, and he used to sit at his kitchen table every night grading papers while Danny did his homework across from him, and Grace hummed while she cooked, and Thomas used to think that was the whole entire world right there in that kitchen, and he was right because when it was taken from him, there was nothing left. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Thomas was at work. Grace was driving Danny home from soccer practice. A truck ran a red light. Thomas got the phone call in the middle of teaching a lesson on fractions, and the last thing he ever taught in a classroom was how to divide something into equal parts, which he would later think about with a kind of bitter, quiet irony, because after that day, nothing in his life ever felt equal or whole again. He didn't go back to teaching. He couldn't stand in front of a room full of kids who reminded him of the son he lost. But he couldn't stay away from schools either, because somehow being near children, even other people's children, was the only thing that made the ache feel survivable. So he became a janitor. Nobody asked him why a man with a master's degree in education was mopping floors for minimum wage. Nobody asked because nobody looked closely enough to wonder. Thomas liked it that way. He didn't want anyone's pity. He just wanted a reason to get up in the morning, and pushing a mop down a hallway where kids laughed and ran and dropped their backpacks was, strange as it sounds, enough of a reason. Caleb Whitmore had been at Ashford Middle School for 4 months. He was quiet, kept his head down, ate lunch alone at the end of the long table by the window, and never once mentioned that his father was Nathaniel Whitmore, a man whose company built half the skyscrapers in 3 different states, a man whose name showed up in business magazines and news segments about the economy, a man worth more money than the entire town of Ashford combined. Nathaniel had insisted his son go to a regular public school under his mother's maiden name, Caleb Bennett, not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because he remembered his own childhood, raised by a father who threw money at every problem instead of showing up for a single birthday. And Nathaniel had promised himself that his son would never grow up thinking that a credit card could replace a father's hand on his shoulder. But Nathaniel worked 18-hour days building an empire, and somewhere in the space between board meetings and business trips, his son had become the kind of quiet, invisible kid that bullies find irresistible. 3 boys in Caleb's grade, led by a boy named Tyler Grant, had decided somewhere around October that Caleb was their favorite target. It started small. Shoved in the hallway. Lunch tray knocked to the floor. Then it became worse. Caleb's homework torn up in front of him. His backpack thrown into the boys' bathroom trash can. And every single time, Caleb went home and told his father that school was fine because his father was tired and stressed, and Caleb didn't want to be one more problem on a very long list. On the day the gymnasium doors slammed open, it had started over something so small it almost doesn't make sense that it ended in blood. Caleb had worn the same pair of sneakers for 6 months because he refused to ask his father for new ones, not wanting to remind him that money existed at all inside their strange, quiet, careful relationship. Tyler noticed the sneakers were falling apart at the sole and made a comment in front of the whole gym class, calling Caleb a kid who couldn't even afford real shoes, and something in Caleb finally cracked. He said something back, something quiet but sharp, and Tyler shoved him to the ground. And when Caleb tried to get back up, Tyler's two friends grabbed him by the arms and held him while Tyler hit him once hard across the mouth. That was the moment Thomas Reyes walked into the gymnasium to empty the trash cans before the next class period, and instead found a boy bleeding on the floor and a gym teacher who had stepped out to take a phone call and wasn't back yet, and a group of kids too scared to do anything but watch. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't run. He walked, slow and steady, the way he used to walk toward his own classroom every single morning for 11 years before his whole life fell apart. And every kid in that gymnasium went completely silent because there was something about the way this old janitor moved that made even Tyler Grant take a step back. Thomas knelt down next to Caleb, checked his lip, looked him dead in the eyes, and asked if he could stand up. And when Caleb nodded, Thomas helped him to his feet with a gentleness that surprised even the boy who had grown up around servants and assistants, and people paid to be careful with him. Then Thomas turned to Tyler Grant and the two boys, still holding on to nothing but air now that Caleb had been pulled free, and in a voice that wasn't loud, but was heavier than anything those boys had ever heard from an adult. He said that he had cleaned up a lot of things in his 11 years at that school, but he had never once had to clean up blood from a child's mouth, and he intended for today to be the last time. Tyler laughed, the kind of nervous laugh kids do when they're scared but don't want anyone to know it, and said that Thomas was just the janitor and had no right to tell him anything. And Thomas said something that none of those kids would ever forget, something that would follow Tyler Grant around the hallways of that school for the rest of the year, whispered behind his back. Thomas said that being called just the janitor didn't scare him, because he had already survived losing everything a man could lose, and there was nothing left in this world that a 12-year-old boy could say to hurt him, but there was plenty this 12-year-old boy could still do to ruin himself. And today was the day he needed to choose which path he wanted to be on. By the time the gym teacher came back from her phone call, Tyler and his friends were sitting against the gym wall in silence. And Caleb was sitting next to Thomas with a wad of paper towel pressed to his lip, and something had shifted in that gymnasium that no one could quite name yet. The school called Caleb's emergency contact, which was not Nathaniel Whitmore's cell phone, because Nathaniel had insisted the school never call him directly during business hours unless it was a real emergency, wanting his son's daily life to feel as normal as possible. Instead, the call went to his assistant, a woman named Priya who had worked for him for 9 years and knew exactly which situations counted as a real emergency, and this one qualified. Nathaniel Whitmore was 3 hours into a meeting about a merger worth $400 million when Priya walked into the boardroom, which she never did unless something was seriously wrong, and leaned down and whispered that his son had been hurt at school. Nathaniel stood up in the middle of a sentence the lawyer was speaking, said nothing to anyone in that room, and walked out. He drove himself, which surprised his driver, who was used to taking him everywhere, but Nathaniel didn't want to wait for anyone. He drove 2 fast down familiar streets that led to a school he had personally visited only twice since Caleb enrolled, both times quietly, and both times without telling anyone who he really was, because he wanted to see his son's world with his own eyes without his presence changing anything about it. When Nathaniel walked into the front office of Ashford Middle School, dressed in a suit that cost more than most of the teachers made in a month, the front office secretary didn't even recognize him, because in this town, dressed the way he was, he could have passed for any concerned father, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He asked for his son and was told Caleb was in the nurse's office being looked at, and that the janitor who had intervened, a man named Thomas Reyes, was in the principal's office answering questions about what happened. Because apparently physical altercations required a report even when the person breaking up the fight had done nothing wrong. Nathaniel found Caleb first. His son was sitting on the edge of a cot in the nurse's office, an ice pack pressed to his swollen lip, looking small in a way that broke something loose in Nathaniel's chest. Caleb looked up and immediately started apologizing, saying he was sorry his father had to leave work, saying it wasn't a big deal, saying he was fine, and Nathaniel sat down next to his son on that small cot, and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, let himself cry in front of his own child because he suddenly understood, sitting in that small nurse's office that smelled like hand sanitizer and stale coffee, that he had spent so many years protecting his son from being spoiled by money that he had accidentally left him unprotected from everything else. Caleb told him everything then, the whole 4 months of it, the shoved trays and torn homework and worn-out shoes he'd been too proud to replace, and how today it had finally gone too far, and how a janitor named Thomas had walked into the gym like he wasn't afraid of anything and pulled him up off the floor and told those boys off in a way that no teacher ever had. Nathaniel asked where he could find this man. He found Thomas Reyes sitting in a plastic chair outside the principal's office, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, looking like a man waiting for bad news, because that was exactly what Thomas expected. He had broken up a fight the way he thought was right, but he also knew how these things sometimes went for people like him, people without a fancy title, people. The system was quick to blame when something went wrong on their watch. He fully expected to be written up, maybe even let go, and the thought of losing this job, the only thing tethering him to a world of children and mornings and small, ordinary purposes, made his stomach twist with a fear he hadn't felt since the day he got that phone call about Grace and Danny. Nathaniel Whitmore sat down in the plastic chair next to him, without saying who he was. He simply said thank you. Thomas looked over, confused, and Nathaniel explained that Caleb was his son, and that he had just heard the entire story from Caleb himself, and that he wanted Thomas to know that whatever happened in that principal's office, whatever the school decided, he personally wanted to thank the man who had done what no adult on that campus's payroll had managed to do in 4 months, which was actually notice that his son was suffering and step in to stop it. Thomas said it wasn't anything special, that any decent person would have done the same thing, and Nathaniel said that decent people were a lot rarer than Thomas seemed to think, and something about the quiet, tired honesty in the way this stranger spoke made Thomas actually look at him for the first time, really look, and something about the man's face seemed familiar in a way he couldn't place, though he had no reason yet to know he was sitting next to one of the wealthiest men in the country. The principal called them both in together, and it turned out the meeting wasn't a punishment at all, because 3 other students in that gym class had already come forward unprompted to say that Thomas had done nothing but protect Caleb, and that Tyler Grant and his 2 friends were the ones who needed to be held accountable, which they were, with suspensions that would go on their permanent records. The principal thanked Thomas for his quick action and told him he'd gone above and beyond his job description, and Thomas, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded and said he was just doing what needed doing. Afterward, in the school parking lot, Nathaniel finally introduced himself properly, said his full name, watched the recognition slowly dawn on Thomas's face as he realized exactly who he had spent the last hour sitting next to on a plastic chair. Thomas didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said that it didn't change anything, that Caleb was still just a kid who needed someone in his corner today, and that the size of his father's bank account had nothing to do with the size of the bruise on his lip. Nathaniel asked if there was anything he could do to repay him, and Thomas said no, and meant it, and turned to walk back toward the school building to finish his shift, because there was still a gymnasium floor to mop and a trash can he never got to empty, and something about a man who had just stood next to a billionaire and asked for absolutely nothing in return made Nathaniel stand frozen in that parking lot for a long moment, watching him go. That night, Nathaniel couldn't stop thinking about the way Thomas had looked at Caleb on that cot, the gentleness in it, a gentleness that felt practiced, like a man who had done that exact thing before, checked a child's face for injury with hands that already knew the particular fear of almost losing someone. He asked Priya to quietly look into who Thomas Reyes was, not to investigate him, but because something told Nathaniel that a man who moved through the world like that had a story. And the next day, when the file came back, Nathaniel sat alone in his office and read about a teacher named Thomas Reyes who had once had a wife named Grace and a son named Danny, and a car accident on a Tuesday 20 years ago. And Nathaniel put the folder down and sat in the silence of his enormous office and understood, in a way he hadn't let himself understand before, exactly what kind of man had saved his son. He went back to the school himself the next afternoon, not through the front office, but by waiting outside by the buses until the final bell rang, and he found Thomas exactly where he expected, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies down toward the gymnasium. He didn't come with money. He didn't come with a check or an offer of a new job or any of the things people expected billionaires to offer as a solution. He came with a question. He asked Thomas if he would consider coming to talk with Caleb sometimes. Not as an employee, not as a favor, but because his son had mentioned quietly on the drive home that Thomas was the first adult at that school who had ever made him feel like someone was actually paying attention. Thomas didn't answer right away. He thought about Danny, about the empty kitchen table, about 11 years of quietly loving other people's children from a safe distance because loving his own too much and losing him had nearly destroyed him. He thought about how easy it would be to say no, to keep that distance, to protect the careful, small life he had built for himself out of the wreckage. And then he thought about the way Caleb had looked at him in that gymnasium, scared and bleeding and completely alone in a crowd of people. And Thomas said yes. What started as occasional conversations after school became something neither of them expected. Thomas started showing up to Caleb's soccer games, standing quietly near the fence, never announcing himself, just being there. He taught Caleb how to fix a bike chain, how to change a flat tire, small, useless practical things that Caleb's private tutors had never once covered. And somewhere in those months, Caleb started smiling more, started standing up straighter in the hallways, started, for the first time since his mother had left when he was 5 years old, feeling like there was a full-time adult in his corner who wanted nothing from him except his company. Nathaniel noticed the change in his son before anyone had to tell him. He noticed it at dinner, in the easy way Caleb talked now about his day, no longer hiding the hard parts. He noticed it in the way Caleb had started sleeping through the night again, instead of the restless, anxious sleep that had worried Nathaniel for months. And Nathaniel, a man who built skyscrapers and closed deals worth more money than entire countries, found himself standing outside his son's bedroom door some nights, just listening to him laugh on the phone with a friend, overwhelmed with a gratitude he didn't fully know how to hold. But this story would not be worth telling if it were only this simple. And here is where everything changed. 6 months after that day in the gymnasium, Tyler Grant's father, a man named Richard Grant, showed up at Ashford Middle School furious that his son's college prospects were now in danger because of a permanent disciplinary record. And instead of holding his son accountable, he decided the easier path was to destroy the reputation of the man who had exposed what his son had done. Richard Grant was a local attorney with more connections in that small town than anyone realized, and he began quietly spreading a story that Thomas Reyes had actually assaulted his son that day in the gym, that the injuries on Tyler's arm from being restrained by other boys had actually come from Thomas grabbing him too hard, and that the whole story of Caleb being bullied had been exaggerated to protect a janitor who had a documented history of instability following a personal tragedy. It was a lie, built out of half-truths and a father's desperate need to protect his own son's future at the expense of an innocent man's. But lies spread fast in small towns, and within 2 weeks there was a formal complaint filed against Thomas Reyes, and the school board, terrified of a lawsuit from a well-connected local attorney, placed Thomas on unpaid leave pending an investigation. Thomas said nothing in his own defense at first. 20 years of learning to survive on as little as possible, of expecting the world to take things from him without asking, had trained him to simply accept it and disappear quietly, the same way he had disappeared from teaching all those years ago rather than fight to stay in a life that reminded him too much of what he lost. He stopped showing up at Caleb's soccer games. He stopped answering his phone. And Caleb, who had finally, for the first time in years, let himself trust an adult completely, watched that trust seem to vanish overnight, and nobody at first would tell him why. Nathaniel found out about the complaint the same week it was filed, because Priya, who had grown fond of the quiet janitor who had brought so much light back into Caleb's life, flagged it immediately. Nathaniel's first instinct was fury, the kind of controlled, dangerous fury that had built an empire, and his first thought was to have his own legal team bury Richard Grant in a lawsuit so devastating it would end his career. But then he thought about what Thomas had said to him that day in the parking lot, when Nathaniel offered to repay him and Thomas had refused, saying it wasn't about money. It was about a kid who needed someone in his corner. And Nathaniel realized that if he simply used his money and power to crush Richard Grant, he would be solving this the exact way his own father used to solve every problem, and it would prove nothing except that money could still buy silence, and Thomas Reyes deserved better than to be defended that way. He deserved to be believed. So Nathaniel did something that surprised even Priya. He asked the school board for a public meeting, open to any parent or student who wanted to attend, and he asked that Caleb be allowed to speak if Caleb wanted to. Caleb, who had spent years being the quiet kid nobody noticed, said yes without hesitation, because the one person who had ever truly seen him needed someone to see him back. The night of the meeting, the school auditorium was packed. Richard Grant sat near the front with Tyler beside him, confident, certain that his connections and his carefully worded complaint would be enough. Thomas sat near the back, alone, having only come because Nathaniel had personally called him and asked him to be there, though Thomas still believed nothing good could come of it. 3 students spoke first, the same ones who had come forward the day of the fight, repeating what they had seen, that Thomas had done nothing but pull Caleb away from danger and speak sternly to boys who deserved far worse than words. Then Caleb stood up. He was 12 years old, standing in front of a room full of adults, and his voice shook at first, but he told them everything. He told them about the sneakers he'd worn until they fell apart because he didn't want his father to know how bad things had gotten. He told them about eating lunch alone for 4 months while pretending everything was fine on the phone every night. He told them how Thomas had been the only adult who ever noticed, and how in the months since, Thomas had taught him things his own life of private tutors and expensive schools had never taught him, patience, and how to fix things with his own 2 hands, and what it actually felt like to matter to someone who wanted nothing from him. And then Caleb said something that made the entire room go silent. He said that his father was Nathaniel Whitmore, and that he had grown up with more money than almost anyone in that room could imagine, and none of it, not one single dollar of it, had ever made him feel as safe as he felt the day a janitor with nothing to gain walked into a gymnasium and stood between him and 3 boys who wanted to hurt him. Richard Grant tried to interrupt, tried to argue that this was an emotional appeal with no bearing on the facts. But the principal, who had been quietly gathering her own evidence for weeks, stood up and revealed something that changed everything. The gymnasium had a security camera. It had been malfunctioning for months, and everyone assumed there was no footage, but the school's IT coordinator had finally managed to recover a corrupted file from the hard drive that week, and it showed, in full, exactly what happened. Tyler striking Caleb. Thomas calmly separating the boys. No violence. No assault. Just an old man doing exactly what he said he did. Richard Grant's face went pale as the footage played. There was nowhere left to hide behind connections or reputation. The room that had been silent with tension now buzzed with a different energy entirely. And somewhere in the middle of it, Thomas Reyes sat with his head down, not out of shame, but because 20 years of carrying grief quietly had never prepared him for a room full of strangers looking at him like he mattered. The school board reinstated Thomas immediately, with full back pay and a formal public apology. Richard Grant, humiliated and facing the very real possibility of a defamation lawsuit that Nathaniel's legal team was more than capable of pursuing, chose instead to quietly resign from his position at his law firm's local chapter of the school district's legal counsel, a position he'd used to intimidate the board in the first place. And Tyler Grant, without his father's protection covering for him, was finally required to complete real accountability, including community service hours that, in a twist nobody saw coming, he served under the supervision of the very janitor he had once dismissed as beneath him. But the story doesn't end in that auditorium, because 2 weeks later, something happened that neither Thomas nor Nathaniel nor Caleb expected. A woman showed up at the school asking for Thomas Reyes, an older woman with kind, tired eyes, who turned out to be Grace's sister, Thomas's former sister-in-law, someone Thomas hadn't spoken to in almost 15 years because seeing her had always felt like looking directly at everything he lost. She had seen a local news story about the school board meeting, about the janitor who had stood up for a billionaire's son, and something about the story had made her finally track him down because she had something of Grace's she'd been holding onto for 15 years, waiting for the day she felt Thomas was ready to have it. It was a box of letters. Grace had written them in the last year of her life. Letters to Thomas she never sent, and letters to Danny for birthdays he would grow into but never reach, And Grace's sister said she hadn't known what to do with him for 15 years, terrified that giving them to Thomas too early would break him completely. But something about hearing the story of who Thomas had become, a man who still, after everything, showed up every single day to protect other people's children, told her it was finally time. Thomas read those letters alone that night, and for the first time in 20 years, he let himself grieve completely, not the quiet, controlled grief he had rationed out to himself for 2 decades, but the full weight of it, all at once. And somewhere in the middle of that grief, he found something he didn't expect to find, which was permission. Grace had written, in one of the last letters, that she hoped that whatever happened to her, Thomas would find a way to keep loving people loudly, because loving people loudly had always been the thing she loved most about him, and she never wanted him to let grief teach him to do it quietly instead. Thomas showed up to school the next Monday, different somehow, though nobody could quite say how, except that he started saying good morning even louder and started stopping to actually talk with kids instead of just passing them in the hallway. And when Caleb noticed a change and asked him about it, Thomas told him, for the first time, the whole story of Grace and Danny. The whole story he had never told anyone at that school in 11 years, and Caleb, this quiet 12-year-old boy who had spent his life being the son of one of the richest men in the country, sat with an old janitor in an empty gymnasium and cried with him. And in that moment, something happened that neither of them could have predicted. They stopped being a broken man and a lonely boy who happened to cross paths, and they became something closer to family. Nathaniel Whitmore, watching all of this unfold over the following year, made a decision that surprised the entire business world. He established a foundation in his son's name, dedicated to funding mental health counselors and anti-bullying programs in underfunded public schools across the country. And he asked one person, and only one person, to help him design the program from the ground up, because he wanted it built by someone who actually understood what it meant to notice a child no one else was noticing. Thomas Reyes, at 62 years old, became the founding director of the Caleb Whitmore Foundation for School Safety, working alongside the very boy he had once carried, bleeding, out of a gymnasium. On the day the foundation officially launched, Thomas stood at a podium in front of cameras and reporters, more attention than he had ever wanted in his entire life. And when asked what advice he would give to any adult watching who felt invisible, who felt like their small acts of kindness didn't matter in a world that only seemed to reward money and power, Thomas said something that would end up quoted in newspapers across the country. He said that the day he walked into that gymnasium, he wasn't thinking about who Caleb's father was or what it might cost him to get involved. He was only thinking about a scared kid on the floor who needed someone to help him stand up. And he said that was the whole secret of it, that you never know whose life you're about to change when you choose to be the person who shows up, and sometimes the smallest, quietest people in the room turn out to be exactly the ones a broken world needed most. Caleb Whitmore, years later, would tell people that the greatest gift his father's money ever bought him wasn't a single one of the things it could purchase, but the friendship of a janitor who never wanted a single dollar of it, and that the day his card, or rather his father's card, symbolically speaking, had failed to buy him safety, it was a man with almost nothing who paid the price instead, not with money, but with the one thing that turned out to matter more than anything else in the world, which was simply showing up again and again for a child that everyone else had decided wasn't worth noticing. And somewhere in that town, even now, if you walked the halls of Ashford Middle School early in the morning, you would still find an old man pushing a mop down a quiet hallway, saying good morning to every single kid who passed, keeping butterscotch candy in his pocket for the ones who looked like they needed it most, because Thomas Reyes had learned the hard way that love doesn't disappear when you lose the people you gave it to. It just waits quietly for the next person who needs it, and shows up without ever asking to be noticed, exactly when it's needed most. If this story moved you the way it moved me writing it, make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this one. Drop a comment telling me which part hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the smallest people in the room are sometimes the ones carrying the biggest hearts.